The Congo Crisis was a period of political upheaval and conflict in the Republic of the Congo between 1960 and 1965. It began almost immediately after the Congo became independent from Belgium and ended, unofficially, with the entire country under the rule of Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, constituting a series of civil wars. The Congo Crisis was also a proxy conflict in the Cold War in which the Soviet Union and United States supported opposing factions. Around 100,000 people are believed to have been killed during the crisis. A nationalist movement in the Belgian Congo demanding the end of colonial rule led to the country's independence on the 30th of June 1960. Minimal preparations had been made and many issues, such as the questions of federalism and ethnicity, remained unresolved. In the first week of July, a mutiny broke out in the army and violence erupted between black and white civilians. Belgium sent troops to protect fleeing whites, and two areas of the country, Katanga and South Kasai, seceded, with Belgian support. Amid continuing unrest and violence, the United Nations deployed peacekeepers, but the UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld refused to use these troops to help the central government in Leopoldville fight the secessionists. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the charismatic leader of the largest nationalist faction, reacted by calling for assistance from the Soviet Union, which promptly sent military advisors and other support. The involvement of the Soviets split the Congolese government and led to impasse between Lumumba and the president, Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, in command of the army, broke this deadlock with a coup d'état, expelled the Soviet advisors and established a new government effectively under his control. Lumumba was placed in captivity and subsequently executed in 1961. A rival government, founded by Antoine Gizenga and Lumumba supporters in the eastern city of Stanleyville, gained Soviet support but was crushed in 1962. Meanwhile, the UN took a more aggressive stance towards the secessionists after Hammarskjöld was killed in a plane crash in late 1961. Supported by UN troops, Leopoldville defeated the secessionist movements in Katanga and South Kasai by the start of 1963. With Katanga and South Kasai back under the government's control, a reconciliatory compromise constitution was adopted and the exiled Katanga's leader, Moise Sombe, was recalled to head an interim administration while fresh elections were organized. Before these could be held, however, Maoist-inspired militants calling themselves the Simbas rose up in the east of the country. The Simbas took control of a significant amount of territory and proclaimed a Communist People's Republic of the Congo in Stanleyville. Government forces gradually retook territory and, in November 1964, Belgium and the United States intervened militarily in Stanleyville to recover hostages from Simba captivity. The Simbas were defeated and collapsed soon after. Following the elections in March 1965, a new political stalemate developed between Sombe and Kasavubu, forcing the government into near paralysis. Mobutu mounted a second coup d'état in November 1965, now taking personal control. Under Mobutu's rule, the Congo was transformed into a dictatorship which would endure until his deposition in 1997. Background: Belgian colonial rule in the Congo began in the late 19th century. King Leopold II of Belgium, frustrated by Belgium's lack of international power and prestige, attempted to persuade the Belgian government to support colonial expansion around the then largely unexplored Congo basin. The Belgian government's ambivalence about the idea led Leopold to eventually create the colony colony on his own account, with support from a number of Western countries who viewed Leopold as a useful buffer between rival colonial powers. Leopold achieved international recognition for a personal colony, the Congo Free State, in 1885. By the turn of the century, however, the violence of Free State officials against indigenous Congolese and a ruthless system of economic extraction had led to intense diplomatic pressure on Belgium to take official control of the country, which it did in 1908, creating the Belgian Congo. Belgian rule in the Congo was based around the colonial trinity of state, missionary and private company interests. The privileging of Belgian commercial interests meant that large amounts of capital flowed into the Congo and that individual regions became specialized. On many occasions, the interests of the government and private enterprise became closely tied, and the state helped companies break strikes and remove other barriers imposed by the indigenous population. The country was split into nesting, hierarchically organized administrative subdivisions, and run uniformly according to a set native policy, in contrast to the British and the French, which generally favored the system of indirect rule whereby traditional leaders were retained in positions of authority under colonial oversight. There was also a high degree of racial segregation. Large numbers of white immigrants who moved to the Congo after the end of World War II came from across the social spectrum, but were nonetheless always treated as superior to blacks. During the 1940s and 1950s, the Congo experienced an unprecedented level of urbanization, and the colonial administration began various development programs aimed at making the territory into a model colony. One of the results of the measures was the development of a new middle class of Europeanized African evoluers in the cities. By the 1950s, the Congo had a wage labor force twice as large as that in any other African colony. The Congo's rich natural resources, including uranium, much of the uranium used by the U.S. nuclear program during World War II was Congolese, led to substantial interest in the region from both the Soviet Union and the United States. As the Cold War developed, politics and radicalization, an African nationalist movement developed in the Belgian Congo during the 1950s, primarily among the evoluers. The movement was divided into a number of parties and groups which were broadly divided on ethnic and geographical lines and opposed to one another. The largest, the movement National Congolais, was a united front organization dedicated to achieving independence within a reasonable time. It was created around a charter which was signed by, among others, Patrice Lumumba, Cyril Adula and Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, but others accused the party of being too moderate. Lumumba became a leading figure within the MNC, and by the end of 1959, the party claimed to have 58,000 members. The MNC's main rival was the Alliance des Bacs-en-Garde, led by Joseph Kasavubu, who advocated a more radical ideology than the MNC, based around calls for immediate independence and the promotion of regional identity. ABAKO's stance was more ethnic nationalist than the MNC's. It argued that an independent Congo should be run by the Bakongo as inheritors of the pre-colonial kingdom of the Congo. The Confédération des Associations Tribalistes du Katanga, a localist party led by Moïse Sombe, was the third major organization. It advocated federalism and primarily represented the southern province of Katanga. These were joined by a number of smaller parties which emerged as the nationalist movement developed, including the radical party Solidaire African and factions representing the interests of minor ethnic groups like the Alliance des Bienzi. Although it was the largest of the African nationalist parties, the MNC had many different factions within it that took differing stances on a number of issues. It was increasingly polarized between moderate évolués and the more radical mass membership. A radical faction headed by Elia Kuto and Albert Kalonji split away in July 1959, but failed to induce mass defections by other MNC members. The dissident faction became known as the MNC Kalonji, while the majority group became the MNC Lumumba. The split divided the party's support base into those who endured with Lumumba, chiefly in the Stanleyville region in the northeast, and those who backed the MNCK, which became most popular around the southern city of Elizabethville and among the Luba ethnic group. Major riots broke out in Leopoldville, the Congolese capital, on the 4th of January 1959 after a political demonstration turned violent. The force publique, the colonial gendarmerie, used force against the rioters. At least 49 people were killed, and total casualties may have been as high as 500. The Nationalist Party's influence expanded outside the major cities for the first time, and nationalist demonstrations and riots became a regular occurrence over the next year, bringing large numbers of black people from outside the évolué class into the independence movement. Many blacks began to test the boundaries of the colonial system by refusing to pay taxes or abide by minor colonial regulations. The bulk of the ABAKO leadership was arrested, leaving the MNC in an advantageous position. These developments led to the white community also becoming increasingly radicalized. Some whites planned to attempt a coup d'état if a black majority government took power. As law and order began to break down, white civilians formed militia groups known as Corps de Volontaires Européens to police the neighborhoods. These militias frequently attacked blacks, independents. In the fallout from the Leopoldville riots, the report of a Belgian parliamentary working group on the future of the Congo was published, in which a strong demand for internal autonomy was noted. Auguste de Schrijver, the Minister of the Colonies, launched a high-profile round-table conference in Brussels in January 1960, with the leaders of all the major Congolese parties in attendance. Lumumba, who had been arrested following riots in Stanleyville, was released in the run-up to the conference and headed the MNCL delegation. The Belgian government had hoped for a period of at least 30 years before independence, but Congolese pressure at the conference led to the 30th of June 1960 being set as the date. Issues including federalism, ethnicity, and the future role of Belgium in Congolese affairs were left unresolved after the delegates failed to reach agreement. Belgians began campaigning against Lumumba, whom they wanted to marginalize. They accused him of being a communist and, hoping to fragment the nationalist movement, supported rival ethnic-based parties like CONAKAT. Many Belgians hoped that an independent Congo would form part of a federation, like the French Community, a British Commonwealth of Nations, and that close economic and political association with Belgium would continue. As independence approached, the Belgian government organized Congolese elections in May 1960. These resulted in a broad MNC majority, the proclamation of the Independent Republic of the Congo, and the end of colonial rule, occurred as planned on the 30th of June 1960. In a ceremony at the Palais de la Nation in Leopoldville, King Baudouin gave a speech in which he presented the end of colonial rule in the Congo as the culmination of the Belgian civilizing mission, begun by Leopold II. After the king's address, Lumumba gave an unscheduled speech in which he angrily attacked colonialism and described independence as the crowning success of the nationalist movement. Although Lumumba's address was acclaimed by figures such as Malcolm X, it nearly provoked a diplomatic incident with Belgium. Even some Congolese politicians perceived it as unnecessarily provocative. Nevertheless, independence was celebrated across the Congo. Politically, the new state had semi-presidential constitution known as the Loi Fondamentale, in which executive power was shared between president and prime minister in a system known as bicephalism. Kasavubu was proclaimed president and Lumumba prime minister of the Republic of the Congo. Despite the objections of CONAK80 and others, the constitution was largely centralist, concentrating power in the central government in Leopoldville, and did not devolve significant powers to provincial level. Beginning of the crisis. Force public mutiny, racial violence and Belgian intervention. Despite the proclamation of independence, neither the Belgian nor the Congolese government intended the colonial social order to end immediately. The Belgian government hoped that whites might keep the position indefinitely. The Republic of the Congo was still reliant on colonial institutions like the Force publique to function from day to day, and white technical experts, installed by the Belgians, were retained in the broad absence of suitably qualified black Congolese replacements. Many Congolese people had assumed that independence would produce tangible and immediate social change, so the retention of whites in positions of importance was widely resented. Lieutenant General Emile Janssens, the Belgian commander of the Force publique, refused to see Congolese independence as marking a change in the nature of command. The day after the independence festivities, he gathered the black non-commissioned officers of his Leopoldville garrison and told them that things under his command would stay the same, summarizing the point by writing "before independence equals after independence" on a blackboard. This message was hugely unpopular among the rank and file. Many of the men had expected rapid promotions and increases in pay to accompany independence. On the 5th of July, several units mutinied against the white officers at Camp Hardy near Thuisville. The insurrection spread to Leopoldville the next day and later to garrisons across the country. Rather than deploying Belgian troops against the mutineers as Janssens had wished, Lumumba dismissed him and renamed the Force publique the Armée Nationale Congolaise. All black soldiers were promoted by at least one rank. Victor Lundula was promoted directly from sergeant major to major general and head of the army, replacing Janssens. At the same time, Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, an ex-sergeant major and close personal aide of Lumumba, became Lundula's deputy as army chief of staff. The government attempted to stop the revolt. Lumumba and Kasavubu intervened personally at Leopoldville and Thuisville and persuaded the mutineers to lay down their arms, but in most of the country the mutiny intensified. White officers and civilians were attacked, white-owned properties were looted and white women were raped. The Belgian government became deeply concerned by the situation, particularly when white civilians began entering neighboring countries as refugees. Lumumba's stance appeared to many Belgians to justify the prior concerns about his radicalism. On the 9th of July, Belgium deployed paratroopers, without the Congolese state's permission, in Kabilo and elsewhere to protect fleeing white civilians. The Belgian intervention divided Lumumba and Kasavubu, while Kasavubu accepted the Belgian operation. Lumumba denounced it and called for all Congolese to defend our republic against those who menace it. At Lumumba's request, white civilians from the port city of Matadi were evacuated by the Belgian Navy on the 11th of July. Belgian ships then bombarded the city. At least 19 civilians were killed. This action prompted renewed attacks on whites across the country, while Belgian forces entered other towns and cities, including Leopoldville, and clashed with Congolese troops. Katanga and South Kasai secessions. On the 11th of July 1960, Moïse Sombe, the leader of CONAKAT, declared the Congo's southern province of Katanga independent as the state of Katanga, with Elizabethville as its capital and himself as president. The mineral-rich Katanga region had traditionally shared closer economic ties with the copper belt of neighboring northern Rhodesia than with the rest of the Congo, and because of its economic importance it had been administered separately from the rest of the country under the Belgians. CONAKAT furthermore contended that Katanga's people were ethnically distinct from other Congolese. The secession was partly motivated by the Katanga's separatists' desire to keep more of the wealth generated by the province's mining operations and to avoid sharing it with the rest of the Congo. Another major factor was what CONAKAT held to be the disintegration of law and order in the central and northeastern Congo. Announcing Katanga's breakaway, Sombe said, "We are seceding from chaos." The major mining company in Katanga, the Union Miniere duo Katanga, had begun supporting CONAKAT during the latter days of Belgian rule amid worries that the MNC might seek to nationalize the company's assets after independence. UMHK was largely owned by the Société Générale de Belgium, a prominent holding company based in Brussels that had close ties to the Belgian government. Encouraged by the UMHK, the Belgian government provided military support to Katanga and ordered its civil servants in the region to remain in the posts. Sombe also engaged mercenaries, mainly whites from South Africa and the Rhodesias, to supplement and command Katanga's troops. Although supported by the Belgians, Katanga never received formal diplomatic recognition from any country. The Katanga's secession highlighted the fundamental weakness of the central government in Leopoldville, which had been the chief advocate of a unified state. Less than a month after the Katanga's secession, on the 8th of August, a section of the region of Kasai situated slightly to the north of Katanga also declared its autonomy from the central government as the mining state of South Kasai, based around the city of Bakwanga. South Kasai was much smaller than Katanga, but was also a mining region. It was largely populated by the Luba ethnic group, and its president, Albert Kalonji, claimed that the secession was largely sparked by persecution of the Baluba in the rest of the Congo. The South Kasai government was supported by Fourminiere, another Belgian mining company, which received concessions from the new state in return for financial support. Foreign reaction and UN intervention disquiet about Belgium's support for the secessionist states led to calls within the United Nations to remove all Belgian troops from the country. The Secretary-General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, believed that the crisis would provide the organization with a chance to demonstrate its potential as a major peacekeeping force and encouraged the sending of a multinational contingent of peacekeepers to the Congo under UN command. On the 14th of July, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 143, calling for total Belgian withdrawal from the Congo and the replacement with a UN-commanded force. The arrival of the United Nations operation in the Congo was initially welcomed by Lumumba and the central government, who believed the UN would help suppress the secessionist states. ONUC's initial mandate, however, only covered peacekeeping, viewing the secessions as an internal political matter. Hammarskjöld refused to use UN troops to assist the central Congolese government against them. He argued that doing so would represent a loss of impartiality and breach Congolese sovereignty. Frustrated, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union, which agreed to provide weapons, logistical and material support. Around 1,000 Soviet military advisors soon landed in the Congo. Lumumba's actions distanced him from the rest of the government, especially Kasavubu, who feared the implications of Soviet intervention. The Americans also feared that a Soviet-aligned Congo could form the basis of a major expansion of communism into Central Africa. With Soviet support, 2,000 ANC troops launched a major offensive against South Kasai. The attack was extremely successful, but during the course of the offensive, the ANC became involved in infighting between the Baluba and Benalulua ethnic groups. As a result, the ANC perpetrated a number of large massacres of Luba civilians. Around 3,000 were killed. The violence of the advance caused an exodus of thousands of Baluba civilians who fled their homes to flee the fighting. The involvement of the Soviet Union alarmed the United States. The American government of Dwight D. Eisenhower, in line with Belgian criticism, had long believed that Lumumba was communist and that the Congo could be on track to become a strategically placed Soviet client state. In August 1960, Central Intelligence Agency agents in the region reported to their agency that Congo experiencing classic communist takeover and warned that the Congo might follow the same path as Cuba.